I see in JavaScript engineers a lot when we get into this infrastructure and reliability stuff. I see a knee-jerk reaction of like, I don't understand it and I don't want to deal with it. And it's natural because it's overwhelming. Really, the only thing I want to fix for people is I want to give them an experience where instead of it's, I don't understand it, I don't want to deal with it, it's, I have the tools to understand. I think that the idea that we're going to sort of build these like platforms that hide everything and the engineer is just going to like happily code their JavaScript with no idea that distributed computing is happening is unlikely to become true. And so my goal that I want for everyone is just to help them have the tools to understand what they need to understand without feeling overwhelmed.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Raygun. They give software teams instant visibility into the quality and the performance of their software. And I am here with John Daniel Trask, co-founder and CEO of Raygun. JD, from what I understand, Raygun is founded by nerds. So you at least accept the term nerds. Is that a good name to describe you and the rest of the team who created Raygun?
Oh, absolutely. Even the folks that don't write software, they're nerds in their own categories, right? They're passionate about it. They love everything about it. I feel like I'm a mixture of a business and software nerd.
Yeah.
Like those two domains, love them to bits.
Well, that's that intersection too that makes interesting what you've done at Raygun. So why did you even create the business? Like, how did you decide to make this your thing?
So I started coding when I was about 9 years old and got my first proper job in 2004 after university. And my business partner today and we used to deliver software which frankly was pretty high quality. And we looked back at what did we do to achieve that. And one of the things we did was we would always email every single error to ourselves. And that just meant that we could fix things before the customer could even contact us. And so we were like constantly impressing people with the quality of what we were shipping. Fast forward a few years later, we built the business and we decided to build a product around that whole workflow that was a lot better than just juggling your inbox. And it turns out that's a model that a lot of developers and a lot of businesses have found very, very effective for increasing their software quality without letting down the users.
Very cool. All right, head to raygun.com to learn more and start your free 14-day trial. No credit card is required. Join thousands of customer-centric software teams who use Raygun every day to deliver flawless experiences to their customers. Again, raygun.com.
This is JS Party, your weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. Shout out to everyone who stopped by the best booth in the building at All Things Open. We received so much JS Party love, which is amazing. And special thanks to our partners at Fastly for shipping our pods super fast to wherever you listen. Check them out at fastly.com. And to Fly.io. Deploy your app servers close to your users, no ops required. Learn more at fly.io. Okay, hey, it's party time, y'all.
Hello, JS Party listeners. Recording a very special show today with two of my very close friends who are close with me, but not with each other. So I am like the shared circle in the Venn diagram. Divya, welcome. You're my co-pilot today. Welcome.
Hello, hello.
And yes, and where in the world are you today, Divya?
I'm in Singapore, and it is in the morning. I think
it is the future.
Yeah, it's the future. It's Halloween today, where I am.
Yes, and it is like Sunday night for me. We're recording this on an off day, off everything. I'm recovering from COVID, so apologies in advance for any open mouth coughing that may or may not occur during the recording of this show. And our lovely guest, Maggie Johnson Pint, is joining us from Seattle. Welcome, Maggie. Hello.
Hello.
This is like a show of sisters for me because I was like, oh, my sisters of the internet, you know, I really do. I feel so special and blessed to be here right now. I feel like the only thing I'm missing is like a glass of wine or a glass of hot chocolate, which, you know, I was too ill prepared to have, but like, we're just going to pretend like that's what's in my hand right now. So Maggie, welcome to the show. We're excited to talk to you today about all things SRE and reliability and what we can learn from that community. And also what that community can learn from us within us JavaScript nerds.
Absolutely.
We have a lot to teach other communities, believe it or not. So before we kind of get into all of that, and we're also going to talk about your new startup, Stanza, which is like incredibly exciting. All my friends are starting companies. I'm like, should I be taking a hint right now? Like, what am I doing with my life? You know? But anywho, so Maggie, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Maggie Johnson-Pint. I am the head of product at Stanza, which is the new reliability platform.
Yeah.
Let's see. Other things to know about me. I come from JavaScript. It's a little unusual. I ended up in SRE. I absolutely consider myself a JavaScript engineer, like the way that we have identity for who we are. I am probably best known for, such as I'm known for anything, having been the original author of Temporal, which is the new datetime API that's coming. It's coming.
Ow. Yeah, I feel like I can't say the word temporal without getting like very excited temporarily. But that was a bad pun.
Yeah.
Let's still get points. But yeah, that's incredible. And also Moment, right? Like you're one of the maintainers of Moment, and you were, I guess y'all have done a really great job of like landing that ship gracefully. And that's its own show. We're going to have you back to talk about that with the rest of the team. But
we should. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I sometimes say maintainer emeritus. I'm still attached to the project. But obviously we're spinning down, and right now I'm not super active. And I do want to give credit to Gilmore and Iskren, who are out there still closing all of the security vulnerabilities when they're found. We're doing most of the work right now.
Wow. Yeah, I forget, like, there's always security patches, right? Like it's never really over.
Never ends. My actual like thing that I still do for Moment is any like legal and trademark, which believe it or not, we get legal and trademark problems too. But yeah.
Wait, are you serious?
So we've had a couple of instances where people publish packages under names on the registry that were really close to Moment that were potentially malicious. And every time you do that, you have to go through the JS Foundation and dispute the trademark and blah, 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 blah. So I've gotten pretty good at that over the years.
Right. Yeah. And I forget, because Moment is part of, I mean, it's a library that's kind of a part of the OpenJS umbrella of libraries that are like important to the ecosystem, such that they have support from a foundation and all that other good stuff. So that's exciting. But anyways, we're not here to talk about Moment today.
Yep.
I'm like resisting the urge of making another bad pun. I'm not going to. We're here to talk about reliability, right? And SRE as like just a broader, that's the term, SRE, right? Some of you are like maybe familiar with the term, maybe not. Yep. SRE stands for Site Reliability Engineering. But Maggie, can you tell us a little bit about the kind of journey that you've made into this world of SRE, coming from a place like many of us, right? Writing JavaScript and doing code things. Yeah.
Yep. The way I got into SRE, let's see. I used to work at Microsoft. It's kind of actually wild. This was 6 years ago now. I was working at Microsoft and I kind of felt like I wanted a different team. And I started kind of looking around. At the time, I wasn't sure what I wanted. I just sort of wanted to change something up. And at the time, Azure was scaling up its SRE organization, which is like far from what a like front-end developer / Moment maintainer would do. But it was interesting. They had a lot of need because SREs are very invested in tooling for reliability and how do we build better tooling. They had a lot of genuine need for front-end developers. They actually really needed to get some people in to help just produce internal tooling and dashboards that was high quality. I mean, Azure's a huge organization. You're talking about 15,000 engineers. So internal tools can be used really heavily, unexpectedly. And so I ended up finding this role working on incident management tooling inside of Azure's SRE organization. And of course, everybody else is a, systems engineer. They work very low in the stack. They work on networks. And it was like all of them and me. And that is how I ended up there. And it's a space I've sort of been in and out of ever since. But yeah, it was almost an accident. Turns out everyone needs front-end developers. Like if you want to go to an SRE org, you can too.
Yeah, you can do this too, kids. You belong. Yeah, I've always thought about JavaScript as like the lowest common denominator. Like every company has a need for like certain types of engineers, and like we are that cog, like, we are that universal cog, the universal remote of engineers just kind of fit in. And what's interesting is like we're also like the most adaptable, I feel like, because I feel like anything like as the closer you get to the metal, there are some very strong cultural norms that I feel like are less adaptive, actually. I don't know. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? What was it like?
Yeah.
You know, there's some cultural exposure that's different, right?
Yeah, so I think, one of the first things to know about SRE or like the SRE movement. So back in the day, we would have said sysadmin, right? You have a sysadmin, and the sysadmin deals with the hardware, the computers, and, things like it deals with the network configuration, things like that. And the SRE movement, I think it's worth, when you bring up culture, it's worth getting into the history of that. So the SRE movement came out of Google, and Google actually made a big initiative. You're talking more like back in 2007, 2008 now, to say, what if we ran systems in a very software engineering focused way? What if we put automation first? What if we put the idea that you would do things through software first instead of thinking of it as a reactive model? What if we sort of proactive and we code for availability? And Google had massive success with this. Google is known for its ability to operate very, very large systems at great efficiency. And of course, if you've ever been an internal Google engineer, you know that this is supplemented by, it's still the best to this.
A ton of tools, internal tools.
Yeah, the best internal tools you've ever seen. And they stay ahead of the industry to this day. So it's worth noting that when you go into an SRE organization, especially in a company like Microsoft that's really trying to be forward thinking technologically, it is a cultural initiative at the core to stop thinking about operating systems in a, what we would say, as a high toil and reactive manner. You'll hear the word toil come up a lot. That's that idea that you have to go in and like poke the config and see what happens and then manually write this script and manually do this thing. A huge kind of principle of SRE is that you would try to reduce toil and you would try to build a culture of proactive automation and proactive analysis so that you can kind of stop issues and incidents before they happen and build sustainable software. Now, there is still some stuff to SRE culture that you find very different than JavaScript. And it's kind of funny, especially working on Stanza, which is a reliability tool that I really hope can benefit JavaScript and SREs at different times. You'll kind of see when you talk to SREs that they're very cautious and risk-averse people. It doesn't mean they don't want to do cool things or they aren't good developers. A lot of them are really monster good coders, but they just are going to approach things as like, how do we do incremental and soft change to deliver things out to the world? And that's their natural kind of state of being. And like, JavaScript developers live in the opposite end of that culture, right? Like JavaScript developers are like changing what they do every 2 days. Like I took a break off of coding for a couple years and I've come back to the stack and I'm like, whoa, I guess we all do Next.js now. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a little wild though, because, if you're not really keeping up, you come back in and you're like, wait, it feels familiar, but like you're in a completely different position on the twister table, like, right? Like, okay, our left foot is now on like red, green, green 7, and our right arm is on red 2 or whatever. Like it's wild, but yeah, this idea of not being super conservative, I think lends us to innovate at the pace that we do. But also, don't you think that some of that is held by the fact that like we don't have to, there's a lower cost to innovating with closer to the front of the stack than there is in lower, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's a huge aspect of it. It's just, the other thing to remember is like JavaScript is kind of on one machine. And obviously if you roll out something that breaks all of your customers, it breaks all of your customers. But JavaScript changes tend to be at the very top of the stack. And so they don't cascade through as badly as like if you break a core networking platform or a core storage platform inside of a large infrastructure, you're going to take everything out. And so just the blast radius of any kind of change is different, right? If we break a button and people can't click it, like it's probably okay. But if you bust storage, you're going to take out everything that everyone is doing. Right. And so I think that really, like, you have to bear in mind anytime you're interacting with an infrastructure team or an internal tools team that works in that kind of lower of the stack area, that like you're used to being able to just slam stuff out there and, well, if it didn't work, we'll roll it back. And they're thinking in very different terms about the blast of their change, basically.
Yeah. And the rollback strategy, right? I mean, and I think web developers maybe can relate to this very closely when it comes to DB scripts, right? So think about your rollback strategy, right? Like, okay, we're going to write a migration script, but like, if this doesn't go well, like, what am I doing, right? And how do I kind of codify the out button or escape button or undo, and right. And the codification gets harder and harder, like the more systems you're touching or the more that you're doing, which is why like small changes are good, you know? So you mentioned like Google kind of really taking the lead and kind of establishing norms and principles and really being the North Star in the community when it comes to SRE practices. But, you know, can you talk about how things have evolved beyond just the good old days of like Niall's SRE Google handbook, right? Like,
sure,
we have infrastructure as code, we've got Terraform now, we have multiple systems. I think for me, one of the things that's still very much missing in the observability world is like more standards, like more tools talking to each other in a uniform way, and like having some standards around telemetry would be great. So can you fast forward to like, where are we now in this journey, and like what's still missing? And also what problems are you trying to uniquely solve with Stanza? I'm curious.
So you actually said something like deeply insightful when you said in this tooling space, there's really a need for more standards. So first of all, there is a standard rolling out there. Have you ever heard of OpenTelemetry for distributed trace? Does that ring a bell?
I feel like I know what those two terms mean. Like I know what distributed means and I know what tracing is. And like, I feel like I can logically come to a conclusion about what is distributed trace, but why don't you double click into that for us?
Sure. So the idea behind distributed trace is that you can watch a request move through your production system, and you'll kind of watch in these chunks that we call spans, you'll watch it move through kind of each server that it's going to interact with. And you can get an idea of, you know, how long does each span take, and, you know, where are we seeing bottlenecks? Where are we seeing errors? Distributed trace will pick up errors. OpenTelemetry is the standard for distributed trace that is actually being bought into by a lot of the cloud providers, like we were working on it at Microsoft. And so what you start to see is that requests can pass through cloud services and then kind of into other things, and you keep retaining that OpenTelemetry based trace, you know, throughout your infrastructure and the providers to give you better information about how things are going. And that probably was very much the first standard that we kind of needed to see come unlocked to be able to start getting tooling to unify in the observability space. There's a lot of, as with all standards, there's certainly a lot of discussion around OpenTelemetry and is this the right way to approach this problem? It's actually really interesting. I was talking to David Kramer, the CTO of Sentry, last week about this, and you know, he was calling out some very real, and I've known about these for a while, issues with OpenTelemetry because it was really thinking in server terms because it came out of this SRE space. And for us as client devs, there are some things that we need around ordering guarantees when you're outside of the server world that it doesn't have yet. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done there to think about how we reconcile some things in that space. But that's kind of the first standard that's coming out. Other stuff that we see that I wouldn't call it a standard, but it's a de facto kind of standard that people are starting to understand from the SRE movement. The SRE movement, if you've ever heard the term SLO or service level objective, that came straight out of Google SRE. And SLO is this concept that you would have an objective for how a service would behave. It's not the same as an SLA. Like an SLA is what you sold your customer. An SLO is an objective for what your real goal is. And it can actually have multiple indicators or multiple submetrics to it. And the idea behind an SLO is as long as you're meeting your SLO, then everybody can keep shipping. But if you fall too far out of your objective, then everybody needs to kind of slow down their ship and work on repair work to get the system back to the level of availability that's required.
Okay.
And this concept you see kind of everywhere in industry. Like we were doing it at Microsoft. I worked at Stripe for a year. Stripe rolled out SLOs. You see that kind of exploding through industry. And sometimes I think people don't even know that it came out of the SRE movement. It's not exactly a standard so much as the way of thinking, but it's being so heavily adopted that you see it, you know, kind of everywhere.
Yeah. Specifically, I guess, with distributed systems, because there's really so much to keep track of. It's not just this big monolith, right? It's like all these little things need to work in Congress, right? So you can think about your architecture as like an orchestra, and the violinists need to do their thing, and right? And so we need to make sure everyone's kind of on key, in tune, and like they can communicate, right?
Yes.
So that's very cool. So can you give us a concrete example of like how SLOs the SLO versus SLA, right? Because I think for folks that might be familiar with one, which is probably the SLO, what an SLA is, right? Like,
yeah, well, so people say 5 nines, a lot of the time, if you've ever heard the term 5 nines in industry, what that just really means is, I think I have to remember exactly.
Oh, it's like uptime. It's like you want to have like 99.999% uptime.
Yeah, it's like 99.99% uptime, which I believe calculates out to like a couple seconds a month of loss. I don't remember exactly what 5 nines is, but it's a very small amount of time.
Downtime, yeah.
And when you talk about the hyperscalers, when you talk about the clouds or any of the sort of like major hyperscale companies, they're always saying, well, we got to hit 5 nines for our customers because they can't have us go down. And that really, the funny thing about it is that it's not super meaningful, right? Like, what is uptime? Because if the server is responding, you ping it and it pings back, then I guess it's up. But like, what if it's really slow? Or what if it's giving you the wrong data? Or what if it's, I don't know, corrupting data, even if it's giving you the right data? Like, all of that stuff would be really bad, right? Mm-hmm. And all of that's availability loss. So 5 nines is this like silly number where everybody talks about it, but like, I don't think any of us really know what it means. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about an SLO, what we'll tend to do is when you're looking at a kind of standard RPC-based or request response service, you'll tend to want to break your metrics into, we'll sometimes call this golden signals. And there's actually really complex ways of thinking about this, but the kind of basic golden signals are latency, throughput, and error rate. So can you get the speed you need on a request response, right? What's your latency? Throughput is how many requests can you put through that system? And then error rate is, what's the rate of errors over time? Yeah. And that's kind of how you usually start to establish an SLO. But a lot of times you end up adding in supplemental metrics depending on kind of what the scenario is or, what the service does. And SLOs are kind of interesting. You can kind of tell they were born out of Google.
Oh, really? I was going to say because it's an acronym, a 3-letter acronym.
Yes, that. No, you could kind of tell they were born out of Google because just when I say those signals to you, they're very based on this idea that you'd have this pure request response. Well, those of us who work in the browser have like made a session state in our life and watched a user click 500 things through that session and seen this path will succeed and this path will fail. Right. And that's just not, when you think about like the Google search, it doesn't do it like that, right? When you think of a low-level piece of infrastructure that you just are sort of requesting to and is supposed to give you something or write some data, that's a very different pattern than what we see when we get into line of business applications and in JavaScript where there's kind of these long-running sessions. An interesting debate kind of out in the SRE space right now is how do we construct SLOs that really reflect the full range of experiences of availability. And that's one place where SREs often could like really stand to interact with client devs or front-end devs more often, because what you notice is that sometimes when they aren't, kind of deeply connected with what exactly the user's doing, it's not that they don't care about the user experience, they absolutely do, but it's not native to them what it is. So if all their numbers look good, then they're like, okay, we're good. And if all their numbers look bad, they're like, okay, we're bad. But sometimes both good and bad can be disconnect from the user experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. How do you tie it all together, right? Like what even is a metric? Is uptime enough? Is like, how do you codify functional versus uptime? It's really about uptime and functional. Anyway, so many things. There's so much to talk about. I also need to take a cough break. So we will be right back. Sorry, I'm already starting to cough. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Square. Develop on the platform that sellers trust. Here's what you could do with Square. You could bridge more experiences. You could build online, mobile, and in-person commerce experiences that connect more customers and sellers. You can build custom booking solutions. You can create and track orders. You can accept payments. You can manage and curate inventory. You can organize customers. You can manage employees. You can extend Square gift cards to your app. You can use Afterpay. And all this is powered by the world-class Square APIs and SDKs that enable you to build full-featured business apps for yourself or millions of Square sellers. So much is available as a Square Solutions partner. Learn more and get started at changelog.com/Square. Again, changelog.com/Square.
Okay, Maggie. That was a really dense and interesting conversation. I feel like I need to listen to that again at 0.5x speed with a notebook, because you just drop so many gems. And that's one of the things I really love about you. I'm going to just shower you with praise because you're my friend and I love you. But I think your takes on SRE are not just on point, but I love the perspective that you bring, kind of being this observer from a different community that's really there to understand these practices for better or worse, right? I really do think having perspective as a software engineer kind of coming into this space, it does give you this level of there's something to compare against, right? And there's so many interesting, I think, aspects of the SRE, reliability, DevOps, whatever you want to call it, the ops culture as a whole that have really creeped into software engineering. And I'm excited to explore that with you today. And the last time I saw you was a month and a half ago. Mm-hmm. You and Divya, all the three of us hanging out at DEX. We were at Sentry's annual conference, having a good old time. And just listening to all these companies talk about their reliability, and you couldn't tell who was a software engineer and who was SRE. And so can you kind of talk about this cultural bleeding? And also, is DevOps dead, right? That's the other thing. We said that we were going to all you need is Terraform, and engineers can now modify Terraform and create Terraform scripts, and who needs DevOps engineers? And so I'm just trying to understand. It feels like we're still very much culturally bleeding into each other, but there's also, I don't know. So what's happening?
Sure. So I have some, if you want to get the hot takes going, you have opened up the hot take ball of wax.
Let's do hot takes.
We had DevOps versus SRE, what's the better model, and people talking about those two things as if they're in opposition, which okay, so my co-founder at Stanza, Niall, wrote that SRE book. And when you go, well, what's DevOps versus SRE? Aren't they in opposition to each other? And I was like, what? SRE is one way that you can do DevOps, which is a set of principles that you would operate systems with a developer mindset. And it's interesting. People kind of love to be DevOps is dead. Now it's SRE. And then now we're getting the, DevOps is dead. Now it's platform engineering. Mm-hmm. And when you've been in this space for a while, you're they're all the same thing. Geez, all it means.
Oh, what does it mean?
We have to be considerate operators of our online systems as developers. Right? When I said the SRE movement or the whole SRE concept was rooted in this idea that we would move away from traditional ops. And for what it's worth, I do think there's still a place for traditional ops, especially I've worked for a cloud provider, down at the hardware level, that stuff's got to get plugged in. Mm-hmm. There's a place for traditional apps, but for most of us who are living in the software world, we're all running online services. There's not mm-hmm. some people who aren't. Who are they?
I mean, I'm pretty sure there's a few folks running servers out of their basements or whatever, but I mean, those things are still technically online. Yeah. I mean, so yeah.
We're all running online services. We all have to ensure availability for our customers. We all have to respond and take ownership of our code. I think mm-hmm. the idea, if you're a developer, the idea that you would have an ops team that just gets your code, and if anything goes wrong, they have to deal with it. Wow, you really think a lot of the quality of your code and the ability of someone who's never seen it to fix it or something, right? We all have to be responsible for our own code. So I think the platform engineering movement that we see now is a response to this kind of explosion in tooling that we see throughout the ecosystem, right? We did get Terraform, we did get Kubernetes. These are really powerful but complex tools. We have a lot of options for hosting, right? We've got serverless tech, we've got containers, we've got traditional VMs. You just have all of these options for how you could set up infrastructure. And I believe the platform engineering movement is really rooted in the more that we can standardize, the more that we can kind of give developers this golden path that they can go on to, and we can make things easier, and we can make that operational story scale across more teams. Loving all of that. Mm-hmm. Going to call out, we were saying that in the SRE times too.
Yeah.
But I'm loving the focus there. I'm a little perturbed by the golden path narratives that I hear coming out.
Before you say that, what is the golden path? Can you define that for folks that when we were in San Francisco in this past September, Golden Path was something that came up a number of times, like in speech and panels and talks. So for folks that might not be familiar, what is the Golden Path?
So the Golden Path is this idea that you would give your teams this sort of standard tech stack, standard build configuration, standard deployment methods, and push them down this path to success. And in general, every organization should be trying to do this because it's too hard to operate a bazillion different technologies and have the expertise for how to run them, especially when you get into the SRE world, like it is unbelievably complex to get a robust Kafka configuration, for instance. Like you got to know how Kafka works and why it works the way it does. So I totally understand why people want to push towards golden paths. And like I said, to me, it's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, we've been doing that for years now, but okay, yeah, I agree.
I mean, but don't you think that happens naturally though? Like, isn't that the cow path, like the path that is the most frequented essentially becomes the golden path? Just, I feel like that's just like the normal evolution of software. Like, there are best practices. We have abstractions that continue to shift the needle, and it feels like that happens naturally.
That is the normal evolution of software, though I will say what you'll find is that software is really diverse, and so needs really become very scattered as teams get bigger. So, Microsoft is an interesting company. I worked there for years, and I can tell you that just in Azure, like I don't even know what happens outside of Azure. Microsoft, I never worked outside Azure. Just in Azure for the internal engineering teams, there's definitely a golden path. Like it exists and has always existed. But the diversity of services just within Azure would mean that golden path was probably only used by like half of teams, maybe. Like genuinely. And it wasn't because they were like trying to be rebellious. It was just like
no, there's just too much gravity to shift. And I totally get that. And those numbers are also reflective of like places I've worked as well. And I totally agree. Like there's people that are on the newest version of a component system, right? And then there's people that are just too busy to upgrade and they're like 4 versions behind. And those are all people that work at the same company serving the same customer. Like that is just the reality of software, to use the kind of front end analogy.
The thing you see play out in time is that if you get too committed to this golden path idea and you say, this is the way it shall be done, and you start pushing really hard organizationally for that, then what happens is when a team falls off the golden path, you get weird cultural things happening where people get angry. They're like, well, why did you have to do that way? And why didn't you follow the rules? And why haven't you changed to follow the rules now? Because you made that decision years ago, but now the golden path would support that. So why don't you migrate everything? And you get in this place. Like I've seen this at multiple organizations. So at a certain point when we get really high on golden paths in our kind of technical dialogue, I worry for us as we grow, because if there's anything I've sort of learned over the years, it's that like you can't really tell people what's right for them, which by the way, like take that deep, because that's not just software advice.
Yeah. That applies to everything.
It applies to everything.
I'm eager to kind of hear from Divya because she's a platform engineer at Fly. And Fly is kind of this other interesting company, which really, is doing a very interesting bridge kind of service, I feel like, for software engineers, right? So Fly is a company that is also, by the way, full disclaimer, they're one of the sponsors of our show. So you may have heard an ad, you may hear an ad, I don't know. We just like talking about it because it's cool new tech. At least I like talking about Fly. It's a fascinating company.
I like Fly.
Yeah, it is.
I'll chip in.
Yeah, exactly. So Fly is all about kind of distributing your compute, right? So taking something like a CDN, right, and pushing that kind of thinking all the way down the stack, right? So doing compute and storage and everything closer to users. And so like Divya, like, what do you think about this platform engineer role that's kind of feels like it's taking on this hybrid, like SRE, DevOps, software engineer? I don't even know.
It's interesting because I think a lot of like what Maggie says rings true, that it's just a matter of, because there's a lot more tooling, there's also a lot more understanding around how to get your code on the cloud or somewhere where it's being served.
Right.
So people want more control. Like the more they understand like how exactly that deployment process works, the more control they want over it. And so that's where like tools like Fly come in, because it's very much like it gives people control over how their deployments work and like where code goes and so on. the thing with platform engineering is like, I have issues with the role also because it just doesn't really explain anything, and also it does a lot at the same time. And it's funny because I think people think it's more hardcore than it really is. I'm like, it's not that hardcore. It's just you do a lot.
Wait, you mean you don't have spikes on your keyboard? Like, what's going on? Like,
Yeah, I wish.
busting myths over here.
It didn't come in. It's back ordered, just crazy back order, supply chain issues.
Okay, right.
But the thing I'm noticing is that platform engineering kind of bleeds into DevOps and SRE to some extent, because you have to understand how the entire system works.
Yep.
And so that, I think, is where the complexity really is. It's not really like you need to know the nitty gritty. It's sort of you need to know everything, which I think is why it's very frustratingly complex. And I think that's usually where people struggle, and actually where I've struggled for a time until now. I'm like, okay, I think I understand how stuff works. Because oftentimes it's like platform engineering, people think about it as like you're building the platform upon which others will build their code off of.
Oh, yeah.
But then the issue is that when you're building a tool that is a platform as a service, like Maggie had mentioned at length, it's just like you kind of have to understand like all of those pieces, and then you also have to make sure that the experience of using it is really clean. And so traditionally when we think of platform engineering, we think of like, okay, people who are like configuring and provisioning servers and like dealing with the back of the back end. But
The gremlins is what I call
Yeah.
them. Like they just come out when things are down. It's like, I didn't even know you worked here. It's like, who are you? It's like, oh, I'm Larry, the platform engineer guy. You know?
yeah, but
It's
also
like-
what I'm seeing is that that's, I think, where the power of someone who works on JavaScript or like
Totally.
the front of the stack, why their skills are really useful, because they're used to dealing with customers and they're used to dealing with users. And so when they come in, it's like, yeah, okay, they might not have a knowledge of all of this, but you can learn that stuff really quickly, actually. And it's like you bring that user experience in and it makes for an amazing platform because you're automatically like filling in all those gaps. And I think that's where a tool like, I bring up Honeycomb a lot because I think their user experience is great and their UI is really slick. And it's very much the idea of bringing something that's so obscure, like observability, and making it very easy to understand in Grok. And I think Sentry does something like that as well, even though Sentry is very much like specific to your like web
Errors.
and like
Yeah.
web specific code. But I think the idea is like platform engineering, SRE, DevOps, a lot of that. I think as we're looking at people writing more or like understanding how their code is deployed and like writing more complex things or just like kind of getting more interested in the back of the stack, there's a need to bridge that gap. And that's where I think the power lies. It's not like trying to go and understand complex systems or like go get a CS degree. It's sort of like you kind of have to understand all of it and then fill in those gaps.
There's a term we'll use in SRE. Have you ever heard ironies of automation brought up before?
I actually haven't.
I have not.
Okay, this is very niche. Like, okay, I'm getting the weird academic niche stuff from SRE, but
Yeah, do it. Go niche.
there's this whole area of study called human factors engineering that actually predates software. Like human factors engineering has been around forever. And this is about as we build or engineer automation, not necessarily computers, lots of kinds of automation, what kind of human factors do we have that can cause failure? So like a sad but great example of a concept in human factors called ironies of automation is like, as you automate things, you kind of get different problems because what happens is while the system is working, everyone is happy and the system is working. And then when it doesn't work, you sometimes have so many layers of stuff that actually nobody knows what to do because machines were doing all of that. And people are like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? Like,
Right.
It's a horrible example, but the 737 MAX falling out of the sky, there was a manual override if the pilot knew it,
Oh gosh.
right?
Yeah, no, hence the irony of automation.
Yeah.
Right? I get that.
Yeah.
I'm watching a show right now on HBO called Avenue 5, and I feel like it's another show that really, it's basically about this like driverless ship with like a fake captain, and like the fake captain is there to just appease is to kind of give the passengers a sense of like human psychology safety, but like things go wrong on the ship, like nobody knows how to fix it, nobody knows how to do anything, right? It's like, oh, we're like of civilization from the future, and we've just automated trips to space.
And it's because like infrastructure's gotten so big you can't fit it all in your head. To Divya's point, it's like, oh my gosh, you have to know a little bit of all of this stuff, which is actually a huge focus of ours at Stanza. Not that we have to go down that rabbit hole right now, but
yeah, no, we're going to talk about Stanza for sure. You're right though, that it is a lot to learn, and for me that's where like I feel like standards and clean interfaces and boundaries like come into play, but it's so hard, right? Because everyone has a snowflake stack.
Yep.
That's the other kind of really big problem is everyone has like 17 different ways that they're doing the same thing. They have very unique architectures, things talk to each other in roundabout ways at every different company. So, how do you really observe it all? Like how, right? And I think for me, that's the next big thing that the SRE observability world needs to kind of conquer is like, we have turnkey observability across your stack.
I was going to say that there's like open telemetry, I think is like a really good example of having open standards within at least that's specific to observability, right? But I think it's a step in the right direction because it's the idea of like taking all of these different ways in which people doing it and then standardizing it so that there's a pathway towards getting to how exactly you monitor systems, which I think is like one aspect of things. And I think, Maggie, you're going to say something else.
So you're completely right. And, we've been talking about OpenTelemetry. To me, the kind of next frontier on it actually is not how we observe systems, but actually how we act on them. Like right now, from an automation perspective, if you want to act across the system, that's a very like disparate set of tools that you're going to be using to manage all of those systems. I think that 5 years ago, we thought, well, we'll put everything in Kubernetes. And like, as it turns out, people really like PaaS services. And Kubernetes is really complicated, thus flies existence, right? Yeah. And so there's actually a second kind of frontier around, there are certain kind of operations, management operations, create a new resource, spin down a resource, scale up, scale down, even like mitigate something like shift traffic, that they're just whatever that tool does. But that, to me, is kind of the next frontier of where the standards aspect needs to go, because that's what allows you to have, when we talk about, I started off saying Google has like a spaceship and all the rest of us have a Fiesta for our automation. And when you really push on like, what is the spaceship? It's actually control plane standardization.
Control point standardization. Words I thought I'd never hear on a podcast. This is like, again, there's so many things I want to nerd out about, and I'm really eager to hear like what approach y'all are taking at Stanza to uniquely solve this problem. And again, like fun fact, like Maggie mentioned earlier, one of her co-founders is the guy who wrote the famous SRE book, the Google SRE book, Niall Murphy. So just lots to get into. So We'll be right back, everyone.
This episode is brought to you by SourceGraph. SourceGraph is universal code search that lets you move fast, even in big code bases. Here's CTO and co-founder Byung Lu explaining how SourceGraph helps you to get into that ideal state of flow in coding.
The ideal state of software development is really being in that state of flow. It's that state where all the relevant context and information that you need to build whatever feature or bug that you're focused on building or fixing at the moment, that's all readily available. Now the question is, how do you get into that state where you don't know anything about the code necessarily that you're going to modify? That's where SourceGraph comes in. And so what you do with SourceGraph is you jump into SourceGraph. It provides a single portal into that universal code. You search for the string literal, the pattern, whatever it is you're looking for. You dive right into the specific part of code that you want to understand. And then you have all these code navigation capabilities, jump to definition, find references that work across repository boundaries, that work without having to clone the code to your local machine and set up and mess around with editor config and all that. Everything is just designed to be seamless and to aid in that task of code spelunking or source diving. And once you've acquired that understanding, then you can hop back in your editor, dive right back into that flow state of, hey, all the information I need is readily accessible. Let me just focus on writing the code that implements the feature or fixes the bug that I'm working on.
All right, learn more at sourcegraph.com, and also check out their bi-monthly virtual series called DevTool Time, covering all things DevTools at sourcegraph.com/DevToolTime.
So one of the things we talked about is how JavaScript engineers can be better stewards of their code and like be better partners with SRE, because one of the things that we focus a lot on in this podcast is JavaScript engineers, and a lot of people here who are listening are more front of the stack. So Maggie, do you have any like pointers or certain things that a JavaScript or a front-end engineer can do better, or at least continue doing if they're already doing, in order to be better stewards and better team players?
One thing that I'll always remind people when you're working with SRE and infrastructure and platform teams is they are taking a lot of requests from a lot of people inside organizations, especially when they're large. And they're in a position that you always have to keep in mind where like they didn't ship that feature that 1 million people used that made $1 billion. Like really, their moment comes when something goes wrong. Like they're getting the really short straw. And so I think it's always really important to remember when you're interacting with teams in that space, there's been a lot of focus on culture and SRE and making sure that we have positive interactions and we're always lifting each other up. And I love that as part of the movement. But I think the first thing is always to have patience. I also think it's really worthwhile to just kind of read up on SRE practice. So we've referenced many times my co-founder's book, This Google Site Reliability Engineering, which is quite a well-known text in this space. It's hefty. There's another book that he also was an editor on called the Site Reliability Workbook. And actually, if I were going to recommend people pick up any book about this, I would recommend that one. And what that is a series of practical exercises and steps you can put in place in an organization to have better reliability. But the nice part is it's a little more bite-sized book. And if you just want to sit down and understand, how do I do good incident response? How do I establish SLOs? How do I come to understand some processes about how we do postmortems and how we think about the human factors in our incidents and things like that? The SRE workbook will definitely get to that in a little bit more bite-sized way. And the other thing I would definitely recommend is if you just want to learn more, you can pick up all of the SRECon series of conference talks are available out there. They publish them. SRECon Europe just happened last week, so there should be hot off the press talks. Those would definitely be worth looking up as well.
I can share some perspective as an engineering lead, engineering manager. Yeah. I think for me, I'm often that person that has to think about what is my definition of done. And it's very different than even just my lead engineer. Sometimes, like, she's off doing something else after. I'm still thinking about the project that just shipped, right? I'm thinking about, okay, how are we going to train our support engineers? How are we going to document this? How are we going to do knowledge transfer? How are we going to share this in the organization? I'm thinking about, our integration tests and end-to-end tests. I mean, definition of done for me is a very different metric, right? Like it's not just code shipped, like done. And so there's the kind of maintenance and education and the socialization of your code that really needs to happen in order to really take care of this and usher this baby into the world gracefully, right? Communicating the change is another big one, right? And I think for me, a level in that is, what's your observability story? What's your analytics story? Have you had handoff with, your DevOps, SRE team, your security team? There's so many other aspects. Once you've released the code, it's not just, it belongs to the company. It's not just this little thing that your team is working on, right? And so how do you usher that code gracefully into your organization is something I as an engineering manager, as a tech lead of many years, that's what I worry about,
One thing, to that point of how do you usher code into an organization, one thing that really I think we're coming to a head on is the moment that product teams and infrastructure teams need to reconcile over is all the time when I talk to infrastructure teams, they're like, we're drowning in work. We can't even get out. We're getting paged every 5 minutes and product does not care. They're going to ship anyways. And I think that's something that it's really hard to hear every time I hear it. When I do customer interviews, I hear it, every other one.
Yeah.
And so I think just being mindful that rolls downhill and that's where you're rolled to, and talking about, are customers getting the right experience, and are you as an infra team living a life you can handle on a regular basis? Just those two things. Do the customers get what they need? Are you getting what you need? If product teams can come in and do that and just ask those questions instead of assuming that that's true, it's going to go a really long way.
Yeah.
Especially if you can go to an SRE team and say, actually, customers aren't really complaining about availability, product, that's not a high concern for them. Maybe we can actually tune down some stuff. Maybe you don't have to be working as hard as you are. They're going to assume that they need to be working that hard told otherwise, right?
Until told otherwise. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I'm a yes to all of this, and I could talk about this for hours. I really want to make sure we have a chance to kind of talk about Stanza. I know it's very early in the company's journey, but you've recently left a, plushy full-time job at Stripe, a place that we both worked together for a little while, to kind of go and start this new baby. So what unique problems are you all trying to solve? And I feel like we've touched upon a few of them already, but love to kind of get some more concrete messaging there from you.
Yeah. So, Divya almost spiked me earlier, whether she wanted to or not. Really, our mission at Stanza is to help you make sense of production and then take action in a way that quickly resolves issues and gets people up and running. And then over time is proactive instead of reactive. And conceptually, we're actually doing a lot of work with ML. So right now, what companies have is, if they're lucky, they have a good distributed trace plumb through using OpenTelemetry. But most companies are not so lucky as to have that everywhere. And so what we're actually doing is using a lot of machine learning to train models to correlate signal across various systems. Like nearly every company that I talk to has both Datadog and Sentry. It's funny, but it's true, because Sentry monitors JavaScript and Datadog monitors the backend. And then you might have Honeycomb too. You probably have PagerDuty. You probably have things going on in Slack. And
Elastic.
Yeah, and you can't correlate all of that stuff. And it's all just random data.
Kibana.
And so we're working on correlating that data, associating it with the service or system that it relates to, and then helping you get this real-time map of production. Sometimes I call it almost like the shadow DOM. I call it the parallel production, right? But it's just like this parallel in-memory representation of what you have in production. Once you have that, then you can start to do things like actually bring reactivity patterns. Hey, I saw that this series of events occurred. Maybe we need to restart. Maybe we need to traffic shift. And you can start to detect patterns, common patterns in production to increase availability or to do graceful degradations.
Or inference, right? Because you can infer which systems also work together, which is something that is hard when things are across multiple stacks, across multiple tools, right? It's hard to say that this error that I'm getting in my email service is related to this microservice, right? Because there's maybe three things or four things in between those, in that chain.
Yep.
So inference seems to be another problem that you all are technically solving as well.
Absolutely. If you can pull the data together, you can start to make some inference of dependencies you may not have known about before. And it's all rooted in just starting to get some ML so that we don't have to kind of manually make all of those correlations, because it's wild to do.
Yeah. It feels like a losing game, right? Because it's like hungry hippos, or it's like weeding your lawn. It's like you just weed it and then there's another weed that pops up on the other side, or just where you de-weeded, because systems are growing and ever evolving. And so this idea that you're going to have everything kept up is just wild, right? So having a system that actually is able to kind of observe your system as a whole, as opposed to add this one other package, add this library, add this SDK to your microservice, and then somebody creates a new microservice and they don't add the SDK or they don't use the new starter template, or right. And then you just lose the story, right?
Exactly.
And so it's like a losing game.
Exactly. And, for companies with legacy tech, sometimes it isn't even viable. You aren't even going to crack that code open. You can maybe build service it, but beyond that can be really difficult. So that's why we definitely took this kind of more fuzzy approach where we're let's see what we can machine learn out of the data. It turns out surprisingly a lot of correlation we can make there, and yes, inference. And then over time, where we want to work to is, like I said, that standard control plane, where if we understand what we can do on things and we understand what series of events are happening, then we can start to make linkages that right now very little makes. Right now, most tools are either you see stuff or you do stuff. There's not a whole lot of see stuff, do stuff tools out there.
See stuff, do stuff. Yeah, you're right, actually. It's you see stuff or you do stuff. You can't really do both. Okay, but so what is the input, though? So how are you ingesting data? Give me an example.
Yeah, so right now, I actually mostly pull alerts. So alerts could be generated out of Datadog, metric alerts, because CPU is running hot or something like that. Or you could pull an alert out of Sentry. I'll give you an alert if you're front end dev when the errors cluster or things like that. And we'll parse actually service names, AWS resource names, things like that out of alerts, CloudWatch alerts we can do. And we'll pull them together and we'll kind of cluster them. And in that, we can start to build out a graph of what you have in production. And because we can time cluster them, and also because we tend to know with alerts, the nice thing about them is what team they belong to. because they get sent to someone to page. It's terrible. We can use both team relationships and time clustering to start to bring together and infer what relationships you have in production. So that's a lot of the data we use. Over time, we really want to start to bring in log data where we can and start to bring in OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry is always going to be more accurate than us when it can be there and when it's complete and plumbed. And so ideally, you start to overlay the OTel traces onto the inferred data to get that more complete picture. And that's pretty high on my roadmap as well, to start to do that overlay.
Wow. That's super cool. Yeah, because that was going to be my question is like, how do you know you've captured everything? Because, it's one thing to have an SDK that's running on every single service or some job that's running, right? Like clicking all the buttons or hitting all the boxes. Like you're just looking at data, assuming that it's being published, assuming that the service names are parsable, et cetera, right? So it'd be interesting to see what kind of checks and balances you can kind of have to cross.
It's definitely a model that sort of accepts imperfection at, its heart and says, well,
right,
we were what we got.
Yeah. No, I mean, tremendously exciting though. And I think for me, what's interesting is like, first of all, every time you said the word ML, I thought you were saying my name. I was like, ML. She's like, oh, we're working a lot with ML. I was like, oh, are we working a lot with me? I'm like, oh, interesting. I'm like, I don't know. I have like just getting over COVID. Honestly, like, it's amazing I can even think right now. But so it's like, okay, ML. So this idea of tools and systems of people, like, and for me, like the best teams are where, the people from different departments and different parts of the stack are working together and the tools are all talking together. And right, it's this like mythical unicorn world that I feel like, I've seen slivers of it here and there, but I've never really seen it totally work in organizations, especially at scale. And so how does Stanza help bridge the people and tool kind of gap?
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Because that gap is real.
That gap is real. So one thing that I'm focused on, like actually I'm writing out the feature set this week and the engineering team is starting on it, is helping people see things that are relevant to them. Like the problem with a lot of mapping tools and a lot of tooling out there is it just gives you a puke of everything from everybody. And a lot of the work that we're putting in, like I said, the part of the reason we started with alerts is you can associate them with the team, is to help people see kind of subgraphs of their production system that relates to them. And then on the edges of the graph, instead of telling you about the whole world, tell you, hey, just so you know, the next kind of cluster graph over is this one. The next cluster graph over this way is this one, to help people build out a model of where they sit technically and where the teams around them sit technically. And right now, a feature I'm working on building out, I call Spotify style onboarding. Like, what GitHub repos do you care about? What servers do you care about? And I think that starts to help us at least get in a place where we can reason about what belongs to us. The nice part about graphs, when you assemble a graph in graph theory, is you can actually like use graph traversals to say, well, what's kind of within 3 traversals of me? What's kind of near me? And I think this will help organizations kind of start to reason a little bit better and start to kind of understand how data is flowing through their system and understand those ownership models and hopefully have a better shot at collaboration instead of just, I don't know who that is, I don't know where it belongs. And hopefully that starts to set some kind of new cultural paradigms we can work under. Definitely when you talk to people who came out of that Google SRE, they said, well, the best thing they had going for them was this ability both to cross-observe and to cross-automate. It wasn't like you had to go beg another team to do something for you. And so whatever we can do to enable people to work through the full scope of the system without begging and yelling.
Yeah, and also like the self-service, right, is huge too. But yeah, that is so cool. I think for me, like self-service, you need this idea of like every service, every team, every kind of functional group, whatever. There should be a front door, right? Like a front door, a waiting room, set of instructions. Some random person shows up. It's like, well, what am I doing here? Am I being greeted? Am I being helped? Am I being serviced? Like, is it obvious what's going on? Like,
if you've heard the term inner source, the idea that you could contribute across code bases or build out internal collaboration models, you want to enable situations where if a team understands their kind of subgraph of resources and they understand what they usually do to diagnose it or to mitigate incidents on it, they should be able to contribute those diagnostic tools and those mitigation tools to a kind of broader graph And then if your team encounters that team and you're like, I don't know if it's them or not, do I want to wake them up at 3 a.m.? You can say, hey, can you auto-diagnose? Or just like, what if we try your default mitigation script? And hopefully we can give some people some freedom to not be in some of the bigger...
Yeah, not get pulled into everything,
Yeah.
right? Not get pulled into every single call. Yeah, I love that concept. And yeah, that is super cool. And I think understanding how many traverses away you are in the graph also can help you kind of make decisions like that,
Yep.
right? Like you can make an educated decision around like, okay, which team do I need to pull in? Who do I need to pull in?
Yep.
You know, and knowing that, you know, you're upstream from these people and you're downstream from these people also helps you kind of create your service plan, like, right? Like it helps you develop your front door story a little bit better too. So
Exactly.
So this is fascinating stuff. I could talk about this for literally hours. Maggie, I've learned so much from you today. I'm sure Divya has as well. And just thank you so much for like gracing us with all this like SRE knowledge. I feel leveled up somehow.
I loved it. I am so glad to be here.
I want to ask you this before we close out. So if you could kind of wave one magic wand and just like improve one story, specifically for the JavaScript community around ops it can be as broad as you want. What would that be? What's your magic wand wish?
Ooh. I see in JavaScript engineers a lot when we get into this infrastructure and reliability stuff. I see a knee-jerk reaction of like, I don't understand it and I don't want to deal with it often. And it's natural because it's overwhelming. And really the only thing I want to fix for people is I want to give them an experience where instead of it's, I don't understand it, I don't want to deal with it, it's, I have the tools to understand. I think that the idea that we're going to sort of build these like platforms that hide everything and the engineer is just going to like happily code their JavaScript with no idea that distributed computing is happening is unlikely to become true. And so my goal that I want for everyone is just to help them have the tools to understand what they need to understand without feeling overwhelmed.
And amen to that. I could not think of a better way to end this show, seriously. So where can people learn about Stanza? Where can people connect with you and your team? Give us the deets.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find Stanza at stanza.systems. And we would love to talk to anybody who has online services, any size organization, about that. We will probably be going to start private beta in the new year, probably around January, February timeframe. So if it sounds like something you'd like to try or be interested in, would absolutely love to hear from you there. You can hit me up on Twitter as well. I am at Maggie Pint. And on LinkedIn, do people use LinkedIn? It's there.
People do, yes.
If you want to literally ask me or someone even better at SRE than me questions, all you actually have to do is hit the book a demo button on stanza.systems and like, dude, we're an 8-person company. That's my personal calendar. Hit me up.
Aww. Yes, awesome. So we'll put links to all of this in the show notes, including the like book a demo link. So excited to learn about the problems you all are solving. So excited to finally have you on the show, Maggie. You're like longtime great friend of mine. Thank you again for gracing us.
Yep.
Thank you kindly. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yay.
All right, that is JS Party for this week. Thanks for listening. Hey, quick favor to ask of you. We've had a few not so nice people leave JS Party some not so nice reviews on Apple Podcasts, which is a bummer. If you have an Apple ID and a free moment, would you be up for helping us undo that damage by leaving a nice review of your own? We'd truly appreciate that. We also appreciate our partners Fastly and Fly.io for helping us make JS Party possible, as well as the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder for helping us keep this party going with fresh beats whenever we need them. Next up on the pod, Amel goes solo with Estelle Whale for a deep dive on some new CSS and HTML APIs you should know about to help in your day-to-day work. Stay tuned. We'll have it ready for you next week.
Web Components has egg on its face because that zeitgeist.